Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Richard, earlier this week, we began a discussion about gender or sex-based differences in the brain. We tiptoed a little bit because, this whole week we were talking about brain myths. Right. And, one of the big myths is that there's this massive difference between male brains and female brains, and that, men are just sort of made to do math and women are made to be, do more creative, literary types of things. And while we know that's not exactly true, what we found is that as we were looking into it, there are a few more differences than than I think many people think. Yeah,
we went down this path sort of talking about brain myths and left brain, right brain, and learning styles and things. And we said, well, let's go ahead and venture into the area of male-female differences, thinking that it would just be another quick podcast. Go into that literature and you suddenly find it's a bit of a swamp.
Yes.
And very, very heated debate. The issue hasn't been settled, as we discovered, and it's been politicized.
Right.
And there are very strong feelings on both sides of this issue.
Right.
And so we decided we better take a closer look at this one. It's a little more difficult to manage than learning styles or left brain, right brain, or we only use 10% of our brain.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we look at some of these differences, and what I think is fascinating is that there are many times that people sort of accept that there are differences when we don't really know, but also that, as we start getting into it, you mentioned that it's politicized, and it's politicized, I think, because what we try to do, or what some people tend to do, is they say, well, this attribute is better than this attribute. And so, because men have this attribute, that's why, men are better in this way. Or, it's the same thing that we got in the, we were talking earlier this week, not on the podcast, but just in some of our other discussions about the Charles Murray book, The Bell Curve.
Murray and Herrnstein.
Right. And they wrote about, a variety of IQ and intelligence differences and things like that. And one of the chapters was about race.
One of many chapters.
Right. And in that chapter, they talked about the difference between the brain's from the perspective of intelligence, as we measured intelligence at the time, between different races, Caucasian, African American, Asian, and so on. And it is so politically charged, and it is very sensitive, because when you say, well, this group of people tend to score this way and this group of people tend to score that way, all of a sudden, again, I think that we try to somewhat artificially apply some type of metric or some type of ranking system to that, and we say, well, if you have those attributes, you're certainly superior to this group over here. And man, that is a really slippery slope.
Right. Whether it's race, national origin, gender, sex, these become highly politicized, highly emotional issues, and we lose the science because of the emotions. We have to be careful about that.
Right.
So what we want to do here is sort of say, we're not interested in those political issues right now. Let's just look at what we do know, and take it. Acknowledging that for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years, men have used various reasons to subjugate women.
Right.
I mean, women have been put, and it's been blamed on hysteria, and it's been blamed on different biological functions. And so, just as neurosurgery got a bad name because of lobotomies, neurobiology, the sex differences in the brain, also have had an uphill climb, because these things have been used to put women in a second-class position. Right. So I understand that. I understand how that occurred and why we need to be sensitive to that. On the other hand, we can't let those sorts of social political issues get in the way of science.
Right.
We don't have to use science for any reason. Let's just see what it is. What I like about these differences is that we know that, and we're going to talk about this later, we know that mental disorders appear in different rates in men and women.
Right.
So it may be that that's the value of this kind of, are there differences? Because there are certainly differences in the rates of mental illness in each sex. So there's good reason to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're pulling information from a couple of different sources, and there's 3 articles that, and you'll find them all in the show notes. And we're going to kind of go through the 3 of them because they kind of build on one another. And so we will. We'll just be pulling some information.
And there's good information in each one of them.
Yeah.
And it leads to the last article that we're going to talk about is really, it's something we're going to certainly keep an eye on as they continue that research. So
yeah, the first article that we're going to pull from is from Psychology Today. Right. The second is from Stanford Medical, and then the third is from a website called The Cut.
Right. From the UK? Is that from the UK?
I think so. Yeah. So we're going to pull from these, and so you can read more. A couple of them are pretty long articles, very detailed articles, and so we would definitely encourage you to read them. So but let's start out talking about just brain differences between the sexes. And again, we're pulling here from Psychology Today, and he mentions, or the author here,
Gregory Jantz.
Yes, Jantz. He is I guess he's a psychologist.
He is. He seems to have a private practice, but he does this program.
Oh, there it is.
Called Helping Boys.
Helping Boys Thrive.
The Helping Boys Thrive. And so it appears as though he has spent time also not only researching but publishing 26 books related to mental wellness. And one of the areas that he talks about is helping boys. And he's written a book called Raising Boys by Design. So it looks as though he has spent considerable time and energy on this topic.
Right.
And he says at the end of the article, he says that there are 100. We have located 100 brain differences between men and women, and that just sends people into orbit. You know, when you start with that sort of thing. But if you go into the article, it's a nice way to sort of start thinking about, if there are differences, where do they exist?
Right.
And I like the way he has structured this article for that reason.
And just to, so that people aren't completely chilled by the 100 gender differences that have been found, in one of the other articles, they'll say, while we do have these differences, there are many more similarities. Right. And so, as we get through some of this, you'll see that. So he talks about 4 different.
But that's a good point that you made. There are 100 similarities. There are 100 differences. There might be 1,000 similarities.
Right.
And that's, I think, an important thing to say. That yes, there are differences, and I don't think there's any real dispute about that anymore. Right. I think there's enough research that's been done in the past 20 or 30 years to say, there may be 100, but don't let that bother you, because there may be thousands of similarities.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah. And we'll get into one of the articles has a very nice graph. Actually, the second article from Stanford Med, it has a very nice image of different graphs, and I like graphs. But you can see some of the areas where the bell curves are separate and very different, and then others where they're like right on top of each other,
overlap,
so you can see that they're very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So so Jantz talks about four areas where there are differences, and the first area that he talks about is processing.
Right.
And so when we talk about processing, we're talking about the way in which the brain manages information, basically. You know, how it receives information, then it does something with that information, and then it sort of elicits a response, or it then concludes with a response to that stimulus.
Right. Yeah.
And there are some differences between male and female.
Right. In the brain, we talk about gray matter and white matter. Right. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, gray matter are the neurons, and white matter are the pathways. That's the easiest way to differentiate the two. Because the path in the early days of brain work, we would stain brain tissue.
I wish we had a
Picture.
A way to draw it. Yeah. Because there's the axons, the long tail of the neuron that connects one neuron to another neuron. They're sheathed by myelin,
which is a fat,
and it's white,
and it's greasy. Well, it's greasy too.
Yeah.
And so the when they would stain the brains, the nerve cell, the body of the cell would absorb the stain, and the axon, because it's covered in this fatty layer, it wouldn't absorb the stain, so it stayed white.
Right.
Okay, and so it was kind of an accident of how we dealt with brains in those years, but. So the gray matter are the neurons themselves, the cell bodies, and the axon are the pathways that take the information from one cell to another. And he claims that men use more gray matter and women use more white matter. And the significance of that is white matter tends to have a more generalized. You think about more things at the same time, whereas gray matter is very focused and very localized, which is sort of how men deal with, they say, well, let's just talk about this, whereas women say, well, wait a minute, there's more to it than that, right? So women tend to be big picture, men tend to be localized. In that book we used for communication, and men would say, honey, I don't care about all that, just tell me what's wrong with the car, and I'll deal with that. But women want to talk about a larger picture.
Now, before we go much farther, we should have done the disclaimer. We're talking in generalities. We're talking about... we're being... Right?
I'm tempted to say, no, I'm not. No.
But we're talking about broad generalizations. Certainly there are men who do not think...
That's right.
Do not process information and behave the way in which we're generalizing, and the same for women. Right. And so it's just important to remember that anytime we're talking about similarities and differences between two groups, we're talking about aggregated data. We're talking about data from a whole bunch of people, all kind of brought together, and then comparing them that way. So there are going to be individual differences, and so don't if you don't match the way that we're describing, or if your spouse doesn't match the way that we're describing, that will potentially happen because we're talking about these broad strokes. You kept saying tend to, and so I thought it was important.
No, well, he says there's 7 times. How does he put it? He said
male brains
are 7 times
utilize
7 times more gray, while females tend to utilize 10 times more white. He's just saying that this might be why we have these differences in how we talk to each other and what we think is important.
But that's generalized data. You see how much fun this is going to be? This is going to be great. But it's, based upon that data, that does explain. Can I say that this is how we get stereotypes? Because many times there is a kernel of truth to stereotypes, right?
There's a reason for every stereotype.
Right. There is some basis for it. Not that a stereotype is 100% true all the time, but it tends to be that men behave this way, and it tends to be that women will behave that way. Not as a criticism, not as a, again, putting some hierarchy to it, but it's just that tends to be that case. And so this is where some of the stereotypes come from. And what he's saying here is that, perhaps these findings help explain why those kinds of stereotypes exist, because we tend to see this in, a good percentage of males and females.
We don't have to be afraid of that.
I'm just saying.
We have a highly educated audience that understands this stuff.
I get the emails. You don't get the emails.
You share them
sometimes. But yes, so we have those processing differences. All right. So and it may help explain why we see some of the ways in which we handle problems and the information that we're looking for, why that differs.
And there's this joke about women are better at multitasking than men. There's sort of this what do they call that? Urban myth. But I don't think anybody can multitask. I just don't believe in multitasking. But that's the stereotype,
right?
That women are better at multitasking. Maybe it's because they have they connect the regions of the brain better than men do, whereas men tend to focus on one thing at a time.
Yeah.
Probably because we're dull-witted and can't handle more than one thing at a time compared to women. That's what some of my female friends would argue. Number 2 is chemistry.
I just feel like we're digging.
No.
Yes, chemistry is the second one.
And that's an easier one.
It is, because the brain, the brain is such a fascinating thing, because the way one cell communicates with another cell is through chemicals. The cell communicates sort of with inside itself electrically, but it communicates between the cells intracellularly with chemicals. What?
Don't try to explain that.
Why?
It takes a whole class to explain
Well,
that.
it does, but it's fascinating.
And pictures. You have to have pictures to show.
I wish I could draw some pictures, but so we have a variety of chemicals in our brain.
About 100 different chemicals
that do different things
around up there.
And there does seem to be some differences between the chemistry in male brains versus female brains.
We do know that. I mean, that clearly has been documented. Men have more testosterone, women have more estrogen. I don't know about the serotonin thing. He talks about men, he said we use serotonin to sit still. That's kind of an oversimplification.
Right.
And he argues that because he would say, well, it's the sit still chemical, but men tend to have ADHD at higher rates than women.
Right.
So that one doesn't make a lot of sense. And he's sort of saying that women have more serotonin, but women have higher rates of depression, which is serotonin. So there's a little complication here, but in general, there are chemical differences between the two brains.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And that is most probably related to those hormones.
Right. That's right.
Because
and so if testosterone is related to aggression, it's associated with aggression, because men have more testosterone, they tend to be more aggressive. Women have more estrogen, they have more oxytocin than men do, and so oxytocin is sort of the cuddle, nurturing, taking care of hormone. And women tend to have more oxytocin. So it's been easier to measure and account for the relative differences in brain chemistry than it is in brain processing.
Right. Now, the third area are structural differences.
Right.
And again, this is something that we can see on brain scans.
Right.
It's again sort of aggregated data, lots of different brain scans that we look at and kind of put all that information together. But it does appear as though certain brain regions are larger or smaller in men versus women. So one of those areas is the hippocampus.
Right.
And it says that typically women have larger hippocampi than men.
Right.
The hippocampus, as you may remember from previous podcasts, is implicated in the formation of memories.
Right.
And so women, so guys, when your wife says that she remembers you doing something, you don't remember doing it,
she's probably right.
She may be right.
And also, it's also related to your ability to sense what's going on in your environment, because you have to remember stuff in the environment. And women tend to sense what's going on better than men do.
Right.
But this is one of those chicken egg stories, because some people would argue that, well, the reason they're bigger is because women do that more, and that enlarges the hippocampus. Other people would say, no, the hippocampus is larger, and that's why they do things. But that's the chicken and egg problem that we always deal with when we talk about these kind of differences.
Right, because we don't study these things until well after the majority of development.
That's right.
And so we don't know if the hippocampus was bigger from the beginning, or if it's bigger because of cultural, environmental, epigenetic types of things. Right. And that's a really important point, because if you grow up in an environment where your role as a male or female is, for lack of a better word, reversed from what is typical or what is often seen in other homes, I don't know if that's would result in significant or profound differences. Would a female brain look more like a male brain structurally? I don't know about maybe even chemically, but we have the hormones issue. But structurally, certainly, would it be different if she was raised as a boy?
And you'd almost have to scan a baby at birth, at 1, at 2, at 3, and follow those across time. Right. And that's research that most people aren't able to do. Right. Even the big study in England is people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. So cultural influences, learning have already occurred.
Right. Right. So there are some structural differences, but it's we gotta.
So we have processing, chemical, structural,
and the third is blood flow.
Right. Where's the blood going?
And right. So so this is really just brain activity.
Right.
Because the blood goes where the brain is active, and so and again there are some differences. Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, men tend to. What he's saying is men tend to focus and then move on. Right. Whereas women tend to stay, they tend to stay and ruminate, not in a bad way. I don't mean in a pejorative way, but women tend to ruminate and spend more time thinking about other aspects of a particular issue, whereas men tend to get right to the core and then move on.
Right. Yeah. So in these differences, between all these four things, the processing, the chemicals, the structure, and the activity, together these four things sort of do suggest that there are sex-based differences between men and women, at least in the way in which the brain looks and typically functions. And again, if you break all these down, you get to about 100 differences. Right. But sometimes those differences are so specific.
Yeah, they're statistically significant.
Right.
If you do these very precise statistical analyses, you will find a statistical difference, but they don't lead to huge behavioral differences. And I think that's where the confusion occurs, is that, there are differences, but they don't necessarily translate into huge behavioral differences.
Right. And I think that this is where it's important to say, when we were talking earlier this week, I think it was Thursday's podcast, that the difference between male brain, female brain. What we were talking about there is sort of, there's no difference in male brain, female brain as it relates to capacity. You can, a female can learn just anything that a male can learn. A female has the capacity to be able to do whatever a male does, and vice versa. So what is important is that even though there's these differences, it doesn't necessarily suggest any limitations or restrictions.
We tend to think of women as teachers, but 100 years ago, medical schools and science labs were closed to females. They didn't have many choices.
Right.
I think I mentioned on a podcast that I worked with the first female graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School. She was the first woman to graduate from Johns Hopkins in my lifetime. Right. And so, yes, women were teachers, and yes, women were nurses, because everything else was closed off to them.
They didn't
have a choice.
Right.
So, but yeah, the capacity is the same.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't until the civil rights movement that really allowed some of those opportunities to open up. And
I think it's clear that there's no difference in math abilities between men and women.
Right.
There are many more women going into math and science today.
And man, I wish I would have looked up when it was we did a week on men's mental health. Remember that?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And we talked about the fact that, in a lot of ways,
yes,
girls are surpassing
that's right.
boys now.
That's right.
And again, I think that this is a surge that's coming from the 50s and 60s of that civil rights movement,
right.
where girls and women are being more empowered, which is great. And so I think that we're going to see that a lot of these stereotypes start to shift very quickly.
100 years ago, Karen Horney and Anna Freud were two
right.
of the only female psychiatrists
mm-hmm.
in the world. Today, 72% of psychologists
right.
are women.
Right.
Right. Because the field was opened up to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as we talk about these differences
mm-hmm.
Between the brain, as we shift to the Stanford Medical article
right.
It's called "The Two Minds: The Cognitive Differences Between Men and Women," you have a new hero.
I wished I had done what he did.
Nareo Shah.
Mm-hmm.
He got his PhD, and then he was like, you know what? I'm not doing anything. I'm going to go back and get my MD.
Well, he went to Columbia,
mm-hmm.
did a PhD, and then I don't know where he did his MD degree, but he has an MD, PhD. But the approach that he uses, this article is entitled "The Cognitive Differences."
Right.
So it's a little sharper focus
right.
than the first one that
right.
said 4 differences. This one focuses just on cognitive differences. And it was based on a study by Dr. Shah. In 1998, he did studies on sex-based differences. And what I like about these studies is he was the one who chose 3 areas: parenting,
right.
mating, and aggression.
Right.
And he chose those 3 areas because they are related to survival of the species.
Right.
And this has nothing to do with math abilities or these are related to survival,
right.
evolution. And that was he's obviously a smart guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's now teaching at Stanford. But he chose those 3 because there's nothing political or
mm-hmm.
cultural
mm-hmm.
about about mating.
Right.
Every species mates in
right.
some way.
Right.
Okay? And so there's nothing uniquely human
mm-hmm.
about it.
Mm-hmm.
And all species do it, and it's based on survival. And so from those studies, they mention a second person, Diane Halpern,
mm-hmm.
who was one time was president of the American Psychological Association. And she did a huge study because she started out thinking that sex differences were cultural
mm-hmm.
and learned.
Mm-hmm.
And so then she set about to do a thorough review of the literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't imagine the amount of reading that she did, because they talk
right.
about not the number of articles, but how tall the stack was of things that she read. And the books that she read were bigger than the stack of articles. She concluded that there are biological differences mm-hmm. based on her
cognitive differences.
Yes, that explain cognitive differences.
Right.
And so this article is not difficult to read, but there are a lot of details.
There's a lot of information.
Right. A lot of information.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so I think something important to pull from this, and you kind of articulated it there a moment ago, and that is one of the things when we look at some of these differences, it is important that we look at the I'm going to use the word evolutionary functioning
right.
of the behavior. Mm-hmm. Thousands of years ago, we lived in a non-technological world, mm-hmm. and so we were hunters and gatherers. We had to go out and we had to find food and we had to do those things. Now, biologically, for any number of reasons, mainly because of testosterone, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, men tend to be bigger, tend to be stronger than females. Right. And so men were the ones that would go and battle wild beasts to get meat for the group. And so because of that, if you think about the way in which we had to to survive at the time.
Right.
Those who were stronger and those who, who's had more testosterone, perhaps who had more of these kinds of biological skills. I'm going to call them biological skills because,
right.
You had to have good visual spatial skills if you wanted to throw a spear to kill a buffalo. For example, you had to be able to measure distance and you had to be able to know how much force to use, et cetera, et cetera. And so those who were really good at that stuff succeeded.
Right.
And if we think about the way that mating works, those who succeeded tended to be more revered, and if they were more revered, they tended to be more attracted by females for reproduction and to continue. And so those genes, those genetic tendencies perpetuated.
Right.
And
well,
is that an easy way to talk about?
Yeah, and that's what Dr. Shaw said, is that the thing about these mating, parenting, and aggression is, he said, there's two features. One, they're essential. You have to have
right.
them. And the other is they're innate. There's no question that they're innate. They're not
right.
these. You don't learn how to mate. You mate. I mean,
right.
Single-celled organisms
right.
mate and reproduce in some way. And so because they're essential and innate, there's no learning involved. Okay? And that's why he chose those three things to study.
Right.
So Halpern comes along and she says, oh, indeed, there are biological differences between the sexes. And here are some of the places where there seem to be differences.
Right.
And one of them is in cognitive, she calls it cognitive differences between men and women. And in fact, women tend to be better at verbal skills, something that we talk about
right.
sort of routinely. We now accept as common knowledge that women are better. But they're also better. They're better at reading comprehension, writing, but also fine motor and perceptual skills. Women are better at those. And memory retrieval.
Right.
And I didn't know that.
Goes back to the hippocampus.
Maybe that's the larger hippocampus.
Right.
That I don't know, but
right.
memory retrieval was a bit of a surprise for me.
Right. And there were some really fascinating studies done in the last decade or so at, I think it was Harvard or Yale, where they showed, the neuroscans of males and females, and when you put them together, that aggregate data again, you see that women, their brains, when they're using language, more of their brains light up. Right. More of their brains are activated when they are engaging in verbal interactions and exchanges and things like that, as compared to men.
Right.
And so we see that activity as being very different when we look at the, again, that overall data between men and women. So it's exactly what she's talking about.
That's
there.
right. Yeah, and men, they talk about men have better at navigation. Okay. But they navigate differently.
Right.
Men tend to have some sense of distance and space, and again, that's that visual spatial superiority or benefit strength. Have, right? Whereas women tend to use landmarks. I remember that building, and I turn at that building. Where men sort of have a sense of where they are in space. When I drive. When I go anywhere, when I think about things, I can imagine myself on a map and north, south, east, and west. And it's very easy to know you have to go east, because I know where it is. And my wife is simply incapable of positioning herself
thinking
that
about
way.
That way.
I went to graduate school with a woman who had extraordinarily high verbal abilities. I mean, she could just do anything. When we were studying the brain, she wasn't able to think in terms of 3 dimensions. We would say, well, just turn it upside down. And she said, I can't do that. But she could explain in words exactly what it was. She was really, really bright, really smart. But she could not manipulate things in 3 dimensions. Right. And at first we would laugh about it, but then we understood that this was just an ability that she didn't possess. But that would be the tail. That would be, she's an extreme because most women can. Okay. She couldn't, but so we see this occurring, and are there real differences? Because if you go back from an evolutionary standpoint, are the structures bigger because that's what we used?
Right.
Or did we use the structures that were bigger?
Right.
Okay, so again,
don't know,
which is chicken and egg.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's that same, women, the way that, how do I want to say it? Women are going to mediate verbally, explanations through just language, whereas men will mediate through visual, spatial, physical, right? So, while you and I are talking, we could say, well, you go down about a quarter of a mile, you go east, and then, you'll be a couple 100 feet down.
Go 3 miles east.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, okay, I know where I am. I can orient myself in space. I know where east is.
Right.
But if you'd said that to my wife.
Yeah. And again, there's certainly women who can do it either way, and there's men that have difficulty.
A woman pilot just landed a Southwest Airlines. I mean, I would say that her visual spatial skills are probably better than mine.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
certainly.
Again, she's an outlier.
Right.
But yes, they're so be careful.
Yeah, she's an outlier even compared to men. From that
That's right.
perspective.
She's better than most men. She can do things that I couldn't possibly do.
Yeah.
Landing a jet on an aircraft carrier requires some visual spatial skills. And one of the other differences that I found fascinating, this article also talks about women have these structural differences, a larger hippocampus, men have a larger amygdala, and the hippocampus is, again, memory and all that. But the amygdala it responds to threats.
Right.
So do men respond, again, men have a larger amygdala, and it's the amygdala that warns you that you're in danger.
Right.
Okay. But again, you have the same question. Did the amygdala get bigger because men were in
dangerous
faced
situations,
more danger on a regular basis?
Taking thousands of years ago.
Right. When we were running around with, think of the Native Americans. I mean, that's all.
Yeah.
You only have to go back to Native American cultures. Women didn't do the hunting; men did. Women were taking care of children and taking care of the tents and teepees and
they were they tended to deal. They tended to do the gathering portion of the hunter gatherer. But one of the other things I like that came out of this article is that they as part of their study they found that some of the visual spatial differences, skill wise, were seen even as early as 2 and 3 months of age.
That's the other thing that I'm glad she mentioned.
Yeah.
That some of these things aren't learned.
Right.
They appear too early to be learned.
Yeah, it says many of these cognitive differences appear quite early in life. You see 6 differences in spatial visualization ability in 2 and 3 month old infants.
When I was at the University of Texas, I worked with a woman who did attractiveness research, and she kept. We know that adults tend to view attractiveness in the same way, and so we think it's probably cultural.
Right.
But she kept going earlier and earlier and earlier, and very, very young children, several months of age. Girls will focus more on faces than boys do.
Right.
Okay, there's some innate, seems to be, because you haven't learned how to do that at 3 months of age. There's something else that is at work, and it's probably innate.
Right.
It's probably hardwired in our brain in some way.
Right. Okay.
And then finally, the importance of these differences may lie, or their most valuable contribution of male-female differences may be in that they point the way to the way diseases occur.
Right.
Mental disorders in particular, because men tend to have higher rates of substance abuse, ADHD, schizophrenia, and autism. Okay, are there biological reasons for those differences? Because the prevalence rates are really high. I mean, we're talking about 10 times. Dyslexia, for example, occurs 10 times more often in men than women. Autism is 4 times. Schizophrenia, 40% greater probability of schizophrenia if you're a male than a female. Okay, women, on the other hand, tend to have higher rates of depression and PTSD. So if there are sex-based differences that might explain these disorders, then that starts pointing the way to treatment.
Right.
Okay, and that would be a valuable contribution.
Absolutely.
Why are there these huge differences among men and women?
Yeah, absolutely. So, now as we get to the, are we ready to move to the last article?
Well, there's one more thing in this article that readers might want to consider, and that's the whole concept of knockout genes.
Okay. Yeah.
Because what you can do with animal research is you can shut off a gene and then see how that affects how the animal behaves.
Right.
And what they talk about at the end of this article is research using the knockout genes, and they're focusing especially on the sex chromosomes. And if you can remove this gene,
it's just amazing,
and then you can affect a behavior. That's because there isn't a big difference between mice brains and human brains. I mean, they're pretty similar,
right?
Not in size, but in function.
And uncomfortably similar.
But uncomfortably. I mean, there's only 2 or 3 genes separate us from primates. Okay, so you take out this gene that's related to your sex, and you can affect that behavior.
Right.
The behavior that should occur doesn't occur.
Right.
So when you get to that part about knockout genes, read it carefully, because that's another way of looking at this and saying, wow, there is something biological happening here.
Right. Right. Now, the last article is from The Cut, and it's talks about the biggest study yet on the differences between male and female brains.
This is really impressive.
Yeah.
When I thought, oh yeah, what do you mean the biggest study yet?
It's a lot
They're
of people.
serious.
Yeah, 5,000 people, more than 5,000
so far.
people. Right.
It's 5,000 and counting.
Right.
And this is done in the United Kingdom. And I have to ask, when the next time we talk to Dan or our colleagues from Psychreg, I have to ask them about this.
Yeah.
The study, because it looks like a huge national research study that they're just scanning thousands of people. Okay. Yeah. So far, they've scanned 5,000. Well, they've scanned more than 5,000, but they have 5,000 brain scans.
Right. Yeah. And it's all, as you mentioned earlier, all 40 people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so they did all of these brain scans, part of the UK Biobank project. And again, this was one that was, interestingly, this is done by a postdoc. So he's still working.
Beginning of his career.
Yeah, at the very beginning, at the University of Edinburgh. And very fascinating stuff here, because it's going to be these types of studies that really give us a lot of information, because, if you have a study with 5,000 people, all 5,000 people getting and doing exactly the same thing,
right?
That's pretty powerful.
Right. Yeah, the more participants you have, the more reliable the results are.
And so, and it's in this article that you see the graphs that I was talking about. I thought it was in the Stanford one, but it's in the Cut. Right. And so he basically had three major key findings. And the first is that there do appear to be many differences between male and female brains. And in his words, the author of this article, in their words, but there's also tons of overlap.
Right.
Okay, so while we've talked about some of the differences that we see, there are many things that are very similar between men and women. And again, as you get to that point, you can see where they overlap, sort of the curve of male performance and female performance, and you can see that most of the time they're
pretty close.
Right on each other.
Right. Yeah. There are some differences. But
yeah.
In most ways, we're alike. But we mentioned that at the beginning of the podcast, where we said there might be 100 differences, but there might be 1,000 similarities.
Right. Right. So now the second thing is that the differences in the long run could help explain and provide treatment for diseases that tend to hit one sex harder than the other. And you mentioned that just a moment ago. Right. And what's great is, while it's sort of hypothesized, it was hypothesized in that Stanford Med piece. Here we have a very large scale study that's sort of finding or kind of coming to the same conclusion,
right?
Which is really powerful, because the more studies demonstrate this, the more confidence we have.
Yeah, why do boys have so many more reading difficulties? Why do they have so much more autism? Those are really fascinating. I mean, those are interesting questions that we ought to find the answers to.
Right. So, and now, in the third finding, and I think this is the main reason why I wanted to include this one, is that despite the fact that we're like raving about this study, that 5,000 participants and counting, they're continuing to do it more and more and more, they still say it's too early to draw any confident causal conclusions.
Right.
So even though we have all of this data from all of these people, very systematically collected,
right,
it's still not enough information to really be able to say this causes this.
Right. So what we end up with is, but having said that, if these researchers look at a scan, if they look at the differences, and they don't know who they're looking at, they can predict with about 75% accuracy whether this is a male or a female brain. That's pretty impressive.
Right.
You can get 3 out of 4 right just by looking at the structure of the brain. Okay, and so there are these robust differences.
Right.
Okay? What we don't know is what the causal mechanism is.
Right, and that's the chicken or the egg stuff that we've been talking about. We don't know if the biological or the cognitive, some of those genetic differences were there first, and that manifested in a 40-year-old the way that it did as those differences, or if culture and life and experience sort of molded the brain to look the way that it does at 40. We haven't looked at enough brains that way, and we need to look at younger brains. But
the value of that early research with very early participants at 2 and 3 and 4 months, this is before learning can occur, and so that's the innate feature, is that some things appear where there can be no learning. Okay, and so you have to say that it's probably innate if it occurs at 2 or 3 months.
Right.
And there are plenty of studies with how children play at different ages, long before they've learned how to do that.
Yeah.
And I can remember one of my friends saying they never wanted their children to play with guns. This was 40 years ago. Yeah, back then. And their kids were young. And they had twins, a boy and a girl. And the kid never saw a gun. Ran outside one time when he was 2 or 3 and picked up a stick and started shooting his sisters with a stick. So where does that come from?
Right.
Because they were determined that they would raise these 2 children, that they were different sexes, they would raise them the same.
Yeah.
Didn't work.
Yeah. And I always think about what our behavioral based colleagues would say about some of this.
Sure.
That well, even at 2 or 3 months, if the mother is giving more attention when the baby girl looks at her face than the boy, then it would increase and result in more facial scanning from the girl than it would from the boy. That's stretching it, I think, because again, at 3 months, your visual acuity isn't great then. So, all right, is that everything? Woo.
Yeah, that's making the data fit the theory.
Yeah. Yes, reverse. It's more
so
like grounded.
Complicated issue, though, certainly, right?
Absolutely.
However, that being said, there are differences.
There are differences.
Right. Now we have to make sense of them.
There are differences, but there are no limitations.
Well, the differences appear in things like aggression and mating and parenting.
Right.
They don't appear in math and science and English literature.
Right.
They don't appear in, your personality character.
Right.
They appear in these essential and innate
survival,
species-specific survival mechanisms. They don't appear in math class.
Right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, that is it then for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.